Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Can you hear me all? Okay, how about now? There we go. We have sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited that you could join us online and in person for our conversation on Indigenous seed keeping and food sovereignty. I'm Yaritza Benitez, the events manager for the Office of Events at CIIS, a nonprofit university. We're here today in San Francisco on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yelamu. I want to begin with expressing our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. We invite you to learn about and support Indigenous communities near you. There will be a Q&A following the conversation tonight, and for those of you that are in the room, the QR codes on your seats will take you to the form. If you're online, you'll find that same link in the event description below the video. And our chat is enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see it. Our speakers tonight are Michelle Gloa and Rowen White. Dr. Michelle Gloa is an associate professor of anthropology and social change. In her teaching, she draws together the learning from land-based and land defense movements that work to cultivate other possible worlds. Michelle approaches her research with over 2 decades of experience working as a part of environmental and food justice movements in the United States and Mexico. Her interest in alternative economic systems has influenced her research focus on how movements conceptualize human relationship to land, ecologies, ownership, and domination from urban gardens to Indigenous-led anti-extractivism campaigns. Rowen White is an Indigenous seed keeper from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne and a passionate activist for Indigenous seed and food sovereignty. She is the director and founder of Sierra Seeds, an innovative organic seed cooperative focusing on local seed production and education based in Nevada City, California. Rowen founded Indigenous Seedkeepers Network, which is committed to restoring the Indigenous seed commons across North America. She teaches creative food justice immersions across the country in tribal and small farming communities, and engages in food system shifts through leadership, mentorship, and organizational design support for grassroots groups. She received the American Horticulture Society's Teaching Award and James Beard Foundation's Leadership Award. She weaves stories of seeds, food, culture, bioculture restoration, and Indigenous land stewardship in her publication, Reseeding Imaginations. And now, it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Michelle Gloa and Rowen White.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. We're on a pedestal tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Rowen, for joining us here tonight and joining us in this conversation. I'm so grateful and excited for the time that we have here tonight and that we're going to get into exploring your work and your thoughts on Indigenous food sovereignty and the efforts to cultivate change in contemporary relationships to food systems and relationships to plant relatives. Before we dive into some of your work that you've done and work that you've done with many others, the collective efforts that you've engaged in, I'd like to ask about your background and how you came to this work.
Yeah, absolutely. You all can hear me, right? I want to make sure that I'm projecting. I have that kind of mom voice. Yeah, great question. So for those of you who don't know about my background, I come from a very small community called Akwesasne, which is right on the New York-Canadian border. I was actually just talking to Michelle about how we have a very complex political landscape, which is that we have an international border that runs right through our community. So half of our community is in so-called Canada, in the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, and then half of our community is in so-called New York State. So that's where my people are from. I'm Snipe Clan, come from a long, long line of people who have stewarded the earth and made good connection to our traditional ways that are heavily steeped in reciprocity and relationality with the earth. But I grew up at a time where there was, again, a lot of cultural upheaval. My grandparents were the last in my family lineage to live and grow up on a farm. It was their generation that was taken away to residential schools as a part of sort of the assimilation tactics in the last 100 or so years. My grandparents were the last in our family lineage to speak Mohawk as a first language. So our language is called Ganyatgeha. It's a beautiful sort of earth-based grammar of animacy language. And so there was this severing of not only our language, but our culture and that sort of tradition of land stewardship that happened at my grandparents' level. And so in some ways it's interesting. I'm sure many of you who are here in the audience also have legacies of diaspora in your lineages, and we also have diasporas as Indigenous peoples here whose homelands are on Turtle Island but still live in a diasporic way, right? Because of the impacts of colonization over the last several hundred years. So when I came of age, I always, when I was younger, I always wanted to sort of get my hands in the earth. I was always asking my mom to, plant pumpkins in the backyard, or I would do this thing where I would get into the pantry and like crack open this big vessel of cornmeal and sort of like immerse myself and like get it all over myself. And my relatives were always saying, "Oh, like that's a throwback to your great grandma Anna Jacobs, who used to grow these amazing gardens," or my great grandma Rena, who was known, in our community for feeding and nourishing us. And so, in some ways, again, these seeds of memory, these seeds of knowledge, they sort of get tucked into our sort of our genetic memory, our blood memory. And so that was something that, as a young girl, I was always wanting to plant gardens, even though we didn't live on a farm at that moment in time. And so I ended up, at 17, I ended up leaving home and ended up on an organic farm in Western Massachusetts, where I was sort of taken under the wing of several amazing organic farmers, and began to sort of open up this doorway or this pathway to, now nearly 3 decades of work with seed keeping and Indigenous seed sovereignty. I ended up on this farm where we were, there was a previous student that had worked on this farm that got really into heirloom tomatoes and the biocultural diversity that exists in tomatoes. And so there was this garden where there were 50 different types of heirloom tomato seeds that were being grown in this patch. And as a 17-year-old girl, I knew nothing about this. Like, I knew tomatoes came in round and red, or maybe in a can, And so I ended up apprenticing in that garden and learning, like paging through all of these seed catalogs and seed packets and reading the names and the families and all of the stories that were held with these seeds, the cultural memory that was held with these seeds. And it was then and there, like reading these stories of tomatoes that had come from Mesoamerica and had crossed the Atlantic, several hundred years ago, and had taken root in villages in Spain and Italy in a way that I think we can't even really imagine Italian food without tomatoes now, but tomatoes have only been in Italy for a couple hundred years, right? It's actually an indigenous food to Central and South America. And then reading about these histories of these same tomatoes a couple hundred years later, traversing back across the Atlantic Ocean in the pockets and vest coats of immigrants coming from Italy and Spain over to the quote New World, throughout places like Ellis Island, and those people wanting to carry with them the taste of home, right? Like the taste of the cooking pots of home, of bringing those seeds as a way in their own sort of migration patterns and their own diaspora to have a little flavor of home. So that was the tomatoes were my first teachers. They were my first like kind of seed aunties or seed grandmas, and ended up like I can still so palpably remember being on this New England dusty farmhouse floor, paging through all those different tomato varieties and beginning to think, what were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors, right? Like what were the, because we had stories growing up in the Longhouse and growing up in our cultural spaces of the Three Sisters and of Grandma Moon and our creation story and all of these, ways in which these foods came to us. But I knew them in concept, but I didn't know them intimately, right? Like I didn't have this intimate connection with them, even though just a short reach to my great grandparents' generation, they still had that. They still had that relationality to those seed varieties. And so I remember asking myself that question, what were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors? And little did I know that opening up that doorway of inquiry would again take me on a 30-year pathway of, I immediately went home to my home community in upstate New York and Southern Canada and began to ask elders and some of whom are now ancestors about, what were the seeds and foods that our people, raised, and what are the heirlooms of our community. And I ended up finding this old, it was like probably like the 11th floor of the UMass library. I ended up finding this old book that was called Iroquois Foods and Food Preparation, which was written around the turn of the century in like 1906 by this white man named F.W. Waugh. And he was a part of what we call salvage anthropology, which was a time and place where they literally thought that we as Native people were going extinct. And so they were rapidly documenting our cultural traditions and our histories and our cultural ways. And so he sat with the women in my community and documented recipes and seeds and food traditions. And in the back of this book, there were some photographs of some of the seeds that he had encountered in 1906. And in a more recent sort of publishing of that particular book, they had kind of done some coloration of those photos. And so I photocopied those 2 pages from that book, or maybe it was 4 pages, and it became sort of a scavenger hunt for me. I ended up taking those pictures and sitting at kitchen tables, sipping coffee, eating good food, and putting those in front of elders. And pretty soon there would be these little mason jars or coffee cans or baby food jars coming out, and we know this one, or so-and-so has this red corn or this blue corn or this multicolored corn, and recipes and cultural memory and ceremonial significance of these seeds started to sort of come out. And pretty soon, as 18, 19-year-old woman, I began to have this bundle of ancestral seeds that were returning home to me. And then so in some ways I was taking them into my bundle and finding my way home through food and seed, finding all of this cultural rematriation, this reconnection to these ways that my great grandmother knew and beyond, but that hadn't been given down to me by my mother, right? And so as I took those back to the fields where I was growing in Western Massachusetts, they took me through a very unconventional rites of passage. That's why I always say they were like my aunties and my grandmas, helping to grow me from a young woman into a mother eventually. And they were like, I always say, I thought that I was growing them, but they were growing me. Like those seeds were growing me into my understanding of what it means to be Mohawk, what it means to be an Indigenous woman, what it means to be a good relative. They taught me so many things. They taught me how to be a mom, and how to care for things in a good way. And so I'm forever indebted to the generosity and the reverent curiosity that they inspired at a young age. Coming of age in a time where, there was a lot of disconnection. There was a lot of mental and physical health issues in our community. And when those seeds started to come back to me, there was, again, this was in the late in the late 1900s, let's say. I'm dating myself. But there was not a lot of young people, these elders who were pulling these seeds out, who had kept them alive against all odds. There were not a lot of young people like myself coming home and asking about them, right? And what we can recognize is that in one generation, those seeds can disappear, right? Those beautiful seeds, the memory that goes along with them, all of that. And so they were so thrilled and excited that somebody like myself was young, was interested, was that next generation stepping up to keep those seeds alive. And just in the last 30 years of being on the seed path, of learning and apprenticing with those seeds and learning from them and them guiding my way, this whole indigenous food sovereignty movement really has flourished and grown and taken root. And now we're seeing young people and old people alike recognizing the importance of our communities reclaiming our relationship to food in a good way and land in a good way. So I feel so blessed. I could have never imagined that, that one summer on the farm, apprenticing with seeds and foods would have, turned into this multi-decade adventure that I still feel like I'm a student of those seeds and of those foods, and still really take good care of those ancestral seeds. But the incredible part is that, from that, I'm a mother, so I have an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old, and they were raised entirely on a seed farm. So they never had to ask the question, who were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors, because those seeds were on their table every day, right? Like those foods and seeds were sort of steeped into their childhood, right? And so what we can recognize is that in just one generation, we can repair and rematriate these traditions. And so in some ways that can offer us a little bit of hope, because each one of you has a story just like mine inside of you. Those seeds of your ancestors that are longing to reconnect to you and longing to hear your voice and longing to know you and to be stewarded by you. You all descend from people who have incredibly storied traditions of food and seed. And so, yeah, there's a lot of hope in that restoration. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing some of your path to how you've come to this work today and your relationship to the tomato and how that really opened the doors in some ways, and the generosity of that plant, and then these ancestral foods that now you've carried with you into your work today. And I'm curious if you could talk to us a little bit about Sierra Seeds and the work you do there, and maybe how it relates to those original seeds that you were receiving at the dinner table or at the kitchen table.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Sierra Seeds really grew out of a number of different conversations. I mean, the origin story of Sierra Seeds is that it started at a seed swap, right? And so when I was on maternity leave with when my daughter was just a babe in arms, I was learning how to be a new mother. These things are not easy. There's a lot of growing edges. There's a lot of emotional ups and downs. And I remember feeling like prior to that, I'd been managing a big CSA farm. I drove a tractor until I was like giantly pregnant, just had a very agrarian pregnancy, and was teaching as an adjunct professor at Hampshire College, teaching about indigenous food systems and seed sovereignty. And so, there was this quiet shift in early motherhood that I think I struggled with. Like I struggled with sort of the isolation of being a mother in this culture and in this society. And so, when my daughter was just young, I started to say, I'm ready to be back out, in the world, back, farming and having my hands in the earth and with the community. And so I started hosting these annual seed swaps and bringing people together of all different backgrounds to share and trade and swap seeds. And this idea of Sierra Seeds sort of emerged. So we were on the West Coast. We had moved out here while I was on maternity leave. My husband does work in forestry out here. And so again, a long way from home, sort of how do I reconnect in meaningful ways? And again, the seeds sort of extended their generosity in their hand to say, well, like, go find the seed people, go find the people who you want to connect with. And so we steward 10 acres on our farm, but we are adjacent to several hundred other acres of forest and wildlands. And so we ended up hosting a seed swap, having some beautiful conversations about essentially, the conversations were around trying to understand what seed sovereignty and seed resiliency means inside of the local food movement, right? So in the early 2000s, there was a burgeoning local food movement. I mean, there still is, but that was like kind of the word that everybody was using, local food systems, durable local food systems. But nobody was talking about seeds at that time. Like, what role does seeds play in a durable, regenerative, and local food system? And so that was something that I was bringing to the conversation in our watershed and in our seed shed, was thinking about, we can focus on local food, but if we don't understand what seed resiliency looks like in our community, like where are the seeds coming that feed and nourish our communities and that our farmers use to plant the local food, then we're missing a huge chunk. And part of that is that when we work with bioregionally adapted seeds that adapt to a very specific microclimate and ecological conditions, they're better suited and require a lot less inputs, require a lot less water and all of these things in our food systems. So we were having these conversations about that. So we originally founded CR Seeds as a cooperative. So it's a seed cooperative where many people in our community were re-engaging and reintegrating seed stewardship back into their farms and then sharing those seeds outward in our community amongst farmers and gardeners. Originally, we had designed it so that we did big seed giveaways and seed distribution, but what we recognized was that there was a need for building seed literacy in our community and really deeply engaging in the mentorship aspect of the work. So it was less about, something that's interesting that I think not a lot of people realize is that the idea of a seed company, like, the idea of that you would plant a garden and before you'd plant that garden, you'd get online and click onto Johnny's or High Mowing or, any of these online seed companies and add to cart and get a seed order. That concept of a seed company is less than 200 years old. And humans have been engaging in an agroecological dance for over 10,000 years. Humans have been co-evolving with plants in this domesticated way. So if you can imagine that timeline of 10,000 plus years of people being I think being domesticated by plants, right? Like, humans are actually being domesticated by plants. It's not really the other way around. And have been saving seed and sharing seed and what in an act of what I call grandma science. Like, all of our grandmas did that. We knew how to save seed. It wasn't something you needed a PhD for. It wasn't a specialized science. It wasn't something that was removed from the farm. So you have all of this, millennia of that happening. And then in just a short blink of an eye, that relationship gets severed, commodified, moved into a capitalist system where now farmers, if you go to any farmer's market, locally, regionally, nationally, most every farmer that you talk to really doesn't save any seeds on their farm at all, right? It's been in a blink of an eye. And so there was this conversation about how can we slowly begin to reintroduce and reintegrate seed stewardship back into our farms and gardens in a good way, and what role could an entity like CR Seeds as an Indigenous seed bank, as a mentorship rooted organization play in rehydrating that in those farm and garden landscapes and demystify it. And so our mantra has been, it's not just enough to grow good seed, but we need to grow good seed stewards, right? Because this work is intergenerational, like the bundle, like let's just go back to the bundle of seeds that I have and carry in our seed bank, the ancestral ones and many other seeds that I've gathered over the years that I've been doing this. But those seeds will outlive me. You know, if we do it right, those seeds will outlive me as a human. And so it's my responsibility as a seed keeper to raise up, whether it's, you know, through my kids or through mentees and students that I work with, it's my responsibility to raise that next generation of seed stewards so those seeds can live on into the future. Yeah. So that was the vision of CR Seeds, was to just create a learning space. We do immersions, like, you know, week-long seed keeping immersions where people just get their hands in the dirt and, you know, get to learn it all. We do online cohorts and learning spaces. There's a lot of different ways in which we can engage it, but it's just so beautiful to witness. People come onto the farm and they get their hands in the dirt, or they are shelling corn or threshing, you know, amaranth seeds, or doing all this. And it just, again, rehydration is sort of the word I always use, because it just rehydrates something old and ancestral and deep in every single person who gets their hands on the seeds. And it's so beautiful, it's so healing, it's so incredible to witness the transformative power of seeds when people get them back in their hands. And I was just at Cabrillo College about a week ago doing a seed keeping workshop, and there was about 50 folks in that space, and just the joy and the you know, the creativity and the hope in that space when people, you know, get their hands on seed. Because again, all of us, we had aunties and grandmas and uncles and grandpas who were doing this work in a good way.
I'm feeling that rehydration just talking about it. Feeling that joy. But also want to return to your discussion of the development of seed companies and that fracturing and disconnection from the practice of having seeds in our daily life or in our normal life. And I want to ask you about sovereignty and seed sovereignty, Indigenous seed sovereignty, and just how you see your use of sovereignty in this case, in a world where sovereignty can mean many different things in different political contexts.
Yeah, absolutely.
What does it mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, I guess we'll back it up a little bit, which is that I've been in, you know, as Indigenous peoples, we're in a conversation about sovereignty from day one, right? Like being an Indigenous person is a very politicized reality in modern day, you know, Turtle Island. I grew up daughter of attorneys, Indigenous attorneys who do land and water rights activism. So my parents worked for a Native American Rights Fund. I grew up in a conversation about what is political sovereignty, what is economic sovereignty, and how is that tied to the land and our relationship to it. So I feel really blessed to have been raised by good people and raised around a lot of amazing humans who recognize our responsibility to continue to exercise our sovereignty and our rights. And so the branch off that tree that I took was this this activism route around food sovereignty. And I just want to give some historical context because I think it's important. You and I were talking earlier in the green room about like how we got to this place where we even have to use the word sovereignty and we even have to exercise that political sovereignty in this time. So I come from people who are part of a Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which for some people you may know of as the Iroquois Confederacy. It was a stronghold of 6+ nations in the Northeast who really banded together. Thankfully, prior to colonization, had banded together under this great law of peace to create intertribal and intercultural solidarity, which ended up becoming our saving grace when those first colonies arrived and the colonial presence arrived in a multitude of ways, because we were banded together in solidarity and working together, so we had political leverage, right, at that time. But what ended up happening was that there was sort of this struggle. There was the French Canadians who were colonizing in a particular type of way that was more integrated. They were doing, you know, sort of like the beaver trades and all of the ways in which French Canadians and Indigenous peoples there was like a more integrated sort of vision of what that sort of society could be. But the British colonial forces had a very different approach to colonization on Turtle Island. And at the time of the American Revolution, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was actually really split between some siding with the loyalists and saying we don't want this emerging nation to take root, on our ancestral homelands, and then some who were in support of this new government. But those who dissented and who were actively pushing against sort of the emergence of this American nation, George Washington sent orders to General John Sullivan into our territories and in our communities. And the one directive that he gave was to burn down our cornfields and was to burn down our food caches. And so what we have, the reason why I say that is that from the jump of this country, from the inception of this country, there has been a movement and a colonial tactic to dismantle our food systems, to disempower us, to disband us, to create disruption so that we wouldn't have the political power to stand up to them, right? We see it, burning our cornfields, of slaughtering the buffalo on the plains, right? There was this movement to dismantle our food systems. And so part of this Indigenous food and seed sovereignty movement is to understand the inherent power that resides at the heart of every seed, that resides inside of our own autonomy and self-determination, to say that this is how we feed and nourish ourselves, because we know that the results of that dismantling of those Indigenous food systems, centuries ago, resulted in the infiltration of a type of system of nourishment, or a food waste distribution of foods that are literally killing us in Indian country, right? We have high rates of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, because of the Western foods that have been introduced into our community. And so this Indigenous food and seed sovereignty movement is about reclaiming our power, our agency, our capacity to say that we have choice in what types of foods we bring to our table, the power that they imbue us, the dignity that they bring into our communities, and the cultural integrity that they inspire. So the work that I ended up doing out of sort of my college track, was my thesis was about the inextricable relationship between Indigenous foodways revitalization and cultural revitalization and language revitalization, and how they're so inextricable. And so, part of this Indigenous food sovereignty movement, as sovereignty being this sort of political power, is that, they want to disempower us by dismantling our food systems. So how can we engage in power building by re-engaging our food systems and seed systems in ways that align with us, and in culturally aligned and relevant ways? And so there's just such a power in witnessing and watching. A lot of our, through the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network, a lot of our allies and partner organizations and grassroots groups are engaging in a holistic cultural revitalization with language, with song, with dance, with ceremony, as a part of, re-engaging a holistic Indigenous food waste system. So there's just a really beautiful power building that's happening as we reclaim what it is that nourishment looks like to us and our communities, and how do we ensure that for generations to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It also makes me think about, in your writings, how you talk about how the seeds don't belong to us, and that we borrow them from our children.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that may be relevant to how you see your relationship to land and waters more broadly.
Yeah.
And in a current cultural moment dominated by capitalist and colonial world perspectives that are more oriented towards the ideology of private property, which tells us we can say this seed is mine, this farm is mine, this is my property, which I can control. How do you see seed sovereignty work, forging a different path?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is, the work that I do in my writing, the publication that I do on Substack is called Reseeding Imaginations, right? And I think we are in a crisis of imagination right now in terms of with our food systems and with our seed systems. I think we've been handed, again, a capitalist patriarchal system of, within our food, even within regenerative ag, even with organic ag, the way it's been infiltrated with a very particular orientation of a type of relationship, proprietorship, hierarchy, right, in terms of our relationship to land. Part of this work with Indigenous Seed Keepers Network was a vision to restore the tribal seed commons, right? That there was a commons, that these seeds, again, as you said, the seeds do not belong to us. We borrow them from our children, right? That the idea that seeds could be owned, that they could be patented, that they could be modified without consent is absolute insanity to us as Indigenous peoples. But we live inside of a culture where all of those things have been normalized, right? There's this really, destructive, exploitative, and extractive relationship that the dominant Western culture has with land, with seeds, and with food. And so part of this work of restoration of the commons is to uplift and resource and empower Indigenous farmers, Indigenous seed keepers to re-narrativize and tell the story in a different way, to say that it doesn't have to be this way. I say this often, and I think this is a powerful sort of fact or a reality, which is that Indigenous peoples are 4% of the global population, living on about a quarter of the Earth's land base, right? And that's been a marked reduction from where Indigenous peoples have lived. Historically, there's been an incredible amount of land loss, but we live on 25% of the surface of the Earth. But in those communities, Indigenous communities across the globe, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity exists in those places, right? And there's maps that show this beautiful connection where Indigenous communities are enclaves of climate and cultural sanity, where diversity thrives. I often say that diversity is the root of our resilience. If we don't have that biocultural diversity to continue to be able to adapt to the changing face of Mother Earth, that we're in significant peril as a human race, right? And so part of this work is to continue, again, in this idea of reseeding imaginations, is continue to model and show in small, brave, and beautiful ways the ways in which we can tell the story of dignified resurgence in our communities and share that beautiful model of relational agriculture and relational land stewardship in ways that perhaps it's just like seeds, like one seed turns into 100 and 100 seeds turns into 1,000. We sow those seeds of imagination and show the dominant culture, this is possible. This type of food system and food landscape that is relational, that is rooted in kinship, that's rooted in reciprocity, that's rooted in abundance, that's rooted in care and compassion and healing is possible. And this whole other nightmare of an industrialized food system is not sustainable. It will be an extinction burst that we will see and flash, in real time. But those of us who are keeping these traditional Indigenous foodways alive, that will sustain beyond this time. And so, part of this is just utilizing story and art and song and all forms of cultural expression to share to the wider world that this type of way is possible. and that the restoration of the commons is possible, that a different way of orienting to seeds and foods. We have seed songs in our communities that tell a story, that sing a story to the plants themselves about their praising them for their generosity. There's this seed song that I carry in my bundle from an Anishinaabe midwife and elder that speaks to them. They say, come in your own time, sacred seed. We humbly implore you that you might give us good life. And what's inherent in those words, like when you hear them in the Anishinaabe language, is that it's establishing the type of relationship that we have to those seeds, which is that it's not like I harvest you when I want to and my timeline and my needs and my own thing, but it flips that, right? And it says, come in your own time. And this word, maji ishka, that's the words in Anishinaabe, it's actually the words that a midwife would say to a woman in labor to the baby coming. And it would say, come in your own time, little baby, right? Come in your own time, little seed. And those of us as seed keepers, we're plant midwives, right? We're stewarding that edge between life and death, between the death of the mother plant and the birth of all these beautiful little baby plants. But it's reminding us that we are indebted to them as seeds and as plants, that we humans are actually in the whole ecosystem and in the whole sort of matrix, that we are indebted to them, and that they give their abundance and their generosity to us when they're ready in that time. And so there's just these subtle cultural shifts that are happening when we inspire Indigenous leadership in organic food spaces. I've been, for better, for worse, inspired to have leadership and facilitation in intercultural spaces, because we know that, the dominant industrial system, even when they co-opt and adopt practices like organic or regenerative, that when they're still rooted in this relationality of dominance or hierarchy, where the humans are better than the plants themselves, then that can never sustain, a resprouting of the commons. That could never sustain, a culture of agriculture that will long outlive us in that way. And so that's why I'm always advocating for Indigenous leadership, Indigenous storytelling, and a reminder that every single one of you that's here today, no matter what your background is, comes from traditions and stories of reciprocity and relationality with their food. And all of us there's not a single one of us that's untouched by the grief of that diaspora and what that means. We all want a different way. We all want a food system that recognizes kinship and reciprocity, and recognizes that we are doing this with our ancestor vision on behalf of the children who are yet to be born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and building off of that, in my work in spaces and community gardens and community herbal mutual aid projects that really focus on that kinship orientation towards plants and the relationality elements, I see gardeners and herbalists really talking about how that relationality teaches them the responsibility
Totally.
to the plants and the responsibility to think about the futures of those lands, and motivates people to act in defense of those spaces.
Absolutely.
And I wonder how that shows up in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Grace Lee Boggs that said, we're moving out of the epoch of rights and into the epoch of responsibility, right? And that little shift of saying, like, I have these rights versus as a human, I have this responsibility, right? To be a good caretaker, to be a good land steward, to be a good relative, to be a good neighbor. I think in this country, we focus so much on our rights and less about our responsibilities in that way. And so, I mean, I think all of this is, again, the plants are growing us, the land is growing us. And we're seeing that in California too. I mean, I don't want to just dwell on the domesticated foods and seeds that we are in relationship with, but just in terms of our understanding of the responsibility to be in good relationship with all of the elements, right? With the fire, right? The way that fire has co-evolved on this land with the acorns and with the pine nuts and with the forest. What is our responsibility to be in good kinship and relationship with all of those elements? Because Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote this incredible book called Sand Talk, and he has another book as well. He said in that book, Sand Talk, he said, move with the land or the land will move you, right? And we're at that time where if we're not moving with the land, we're not moving with the seeds, we're not listening to the ways that they evolve and grow, that there'll be collapse, there'll be destruction, there'll be devastating wildfires, there'll be ecological disasters, and we're seeing that in real time. And so part of this is going back to seed time, right? To this different pace of how we engage in the work. The seeds will outlive us. It's just a matter of whether we humans continue to listen and be in right relationship to them.
Well, I want to go back to your discussion of art and your engagement with art and poetry and song, and ask you if you can speak about your short film, Seed Mother Coming Home, and the work of seed matriation.
Yeah, absolutely. So quite a number of years ago, I met Mateo Hinojosa from the Cultural Conservancy, and we were starting to cook up this idea of creating a little love poem to the movement. You know, the rematriation movement, I will say, as well as the land rematriation movement, it's dynamic, it's layered. You know, there's this sort of, I guess, romanticized veneer of this work, and then underneath it, there's a lot of gifts and shadows, right? Of like the messiness, the grief-soakedness, the intensity, the immensity of what it means to metabolize and to digest the grief of disconnection, the grief of rematriation only needs to happen when you have diaspora, right? They're like sort of like if you're living in diaspora, that's why we have to rematriate seeds and people to seeds and seeds to land and people to land. And so we ended up writing this, co-directing and writing this beautiful love poem. It's an 8-minute short little film. We worked with a local Indigenous artist to do some animation. We used a lot of the seeds from our farm. They're sort of in the credit rolls, we actually credit all the different seed varieties that have starred in our movie. You can find it on YouTube, on the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance YouTube channel. But we, I did the voiceover. It was sort of a prose poem, kind of love poem to the movement. We had kind of hoped to do a feature-length film, and in fact, right now, one of my colleagues and sisters from home, Gudjajuni Fox, actually just did a feature-length film all about our original seeds for PBS, and so it's just now airing on PBS. And so I'll definitely share some of the information of that film with you all. But it really is just telling, there's a larger movement of Indigenous peoples restoring their connection with the earth and restoring their indigenous foodways and needing seeds to come home to them, like from various places where they've traveled, whether they're in museums or seed banks or universities, and finding those seeds and bringing them home again. So we were sort of sharing some of the beautiful collective stories. There's a number of different seed farmers that we highlight in this film. But it also, like, part of it is sharing the intimacy and the vulnerability of this work. So we focus a lot on, here in the Bay Area, we have Segorte Land Trust, and they're doing incredible land rematriation work. And, all across Turtle Island, there's many of us who are engaging in this work. But what we don't remember, I think sometimes we fail to recognize is that while we're doing this big collective work of rematriation, we're all going through very intimate, vulnerable, intense, and grief-soaked individual journeys of rematriation. Like the story I told to you all, right? The story of, that my grandma, like, literally had her language beaten out of her and was told that her cultural ways and her being Mohawk was a stain or a sin, right? And that was something that was no longer good. But here, just a couple generations later, I'm rematriating myself back to our language, rematriating myself back to the land and back to seeds in a good way. And there's been beautiful celebratory moments, and there have been absolutely like rock bottom, grief-soaked aspects of that. And I think part of us wanting to put that film out there was to show not only the beautiful celebratory moments, but also showcase the needed vulnerability in this work, that we need to be vulnerable in these movements. We need to be able to create safe and brave spaces that honor the trauma, you know, and be trauma informed in our approach to this work, and make sure that people are well taken care of as we walk this rematriation path.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I really want to sit with what it looks like to be vulnerable together in movements. And I'm curious to hear more about your work with the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network. And I remember a couple of years ago you speaking about the what were they called? The hubs, the cooperative seed hubs, and the development of those seed hubs in different parts of the country, bringing people together around their practices for seed rematriation and seed work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the whole thing is that we can't do this work alone, right? Like, you know, we can have our little gardens and our little community plots, but it's only in building community and building that network of support and solidarity and relationality is this work going to sustain and thrive. And I have a very, very strong commitment to creating spaces that honor intercultural solidarity and connection. Like, I think in this time, you know, in a time of, you know, a political environment where there's a push for divisiveness and political divides and cultural divides, that we have to push back in that in all kinds of ways. And some of that is recognizing that this work is intercultural, that we all live here on Turtle Island, regardless of, you know, many of us have grief-soaked stories of migration, immigration, and diaspora, but we all live here. So it's all of our responsibility to continue to work towards building a more relational landscape of nourishment. So our commitment at Indigenous Seedkeepers Network was really looking at creating these cooperative seed and food hubs that were intergenerational spaces where people could come and gather and reconnect in meaningful ways to the land, to seeds, to food preparation, to like hunting and foraging and medicine making, and, you know, all of the various things that contribute to our diverse food landscapes. So, for instance, about 12 years ago, we had an opportunity to engage in a land rematriation work with between my tribe at Akwesasne and a place called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Kingston, New York. And the Hudson Valley Farm Hub is a very well-resourced sort of incubator farm, but they thankfully felt the responsibility to engage in not only a land acknowledgement or a conversation with the Indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands that they were farming on, but to act on that in meaningful ways. And so 12 years ago, we planted the first of a dozen rematriation gardens there on that land. In a significant way, we had taken some corn seeds, so that initial, and I want to say this, and you all might think it's crazy, but I had gone to that land and to that place to visit a friend. This was kind of before the idea of the seed rematriation garden had emerged. And we had this beautiful gathering at Onondaga, which is in our Haudenosaunee communities is the keeper of the central fire. So we have 6 nations, and the Onondaga keep the central fire. And so we'd had a intergenerational gathering of Indigenous seed and food practitioners dedicated to the seeds and dedicated to these conversations about what does it mean as a community, as a collective, as a confederacy, to really dedicate resources and time and energy towards the restoration of our seeds for the benefit of future generations. And I came away from that gathering and ended up going to a friend's farm, a non-native friend's farm, and staying for a couple of nights because he had a seed library, and I was kind of curious how they did the sort of things over there. I was kind of in learning mode. And I remember sleeping that night, and there was this basket of seeds that there had been a seed swap at that gathering. And these beans, these 2 bean varieties were like, we're staying here. You know, that was their message to me, was that they were going to stay here. And so that morning I talked to my friend Kay and I said, these beans don't want to leave here, so I'm entrusting them to you. Why don't you grow them this year? You know, and I was driving back across the country with my 2 kids. They were young at the time. And I remember getting a call probably about a week later, and he said, "You'll never believe this, but I think those beans set something in motion," because he had gotten a call from this Hudson Valley Farm Hub saying, "We got this idea that we wanted to engage in a Native American seed sanctuary garden on the farm and start to engage in meaningful land acknowledgement and rematriation." And I was like, those beans have been up to something. And so they got to work, I guess, and sort of sent messages far and wide. And we planted those bean seeds along with the first crop of, so there had been this red corn, this Mohawk red corn, that had gone nearly to extinction in our communities. And my seed elder, Steve McCumber, had rescued that seed from an elder at Gotnawage and had grown it out from 2 cobs of corn that were left on the whole face of the earth, and had grown it into a sizable little basket of corn, and had shared that corn seed over to me. And I had grown it from a small amount into about an acre of corn. And so when we had that inaugural seed rematriation garden at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub with our tribal seed members, we grew that original red corn and ended up having like 2,000 pounds of this red corn that had gone from the brink of extinction to just a vibrant amount of corn. And so we subsequently engaged in that seed rematriation garden over the last dozen years, which initiated a relationship with some philanthropists in the region who, over several sort of plant generations, several seasons of us growing this land rematriation garden, ended up donating over a couple of years, over $4.5 million back to our home community, to the Akwesasne Freedom School, which is, the Akwesasne Freedom School is one of the longest standing language and culture immersion K through 12 schools in the country. So they operate in language, is in a mission to bring back first language speakers of our Mohawk language again. And so it's immersion environment from kindergarten, you know, upward. And so essentially that money went to renovating a building that was on a 160-acre farm adjacent to the Akwesasne Freedom School campus. And we were able to create one of the first cooperative seed hubs on Turtle Island that was intergenerational, that was engaged with this cultural revitalization school. And now we have classes, culinary workshops, seed keeping workshops, planting workshops, kids and elders alike working together in this seed and food hub, which provides a model for some of the other food and seed hub development that we're doing across Turtle Island. And so that's a success story. And I really pay homage to those beans and corn and those seeds who really catalyzed, you know, and really rehydrated something in the hearts and minds of all of the people, native and non-native alike, who leveraged whatever resources they had in that moment, whether it was the cultural memory and the cultural knowledge, or the resources and the wealth in both money and land, to catalyze that, to eventually end up in this model where we can build something. And that's a model I think that's replicable within Native communities, but there are bodies of culture and communities of culture all across Turtle Island that could benefit from building these type of cooperative seed hubs in a good way. So.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful story and wonderful to hear the success story of it. And I'm curious also if you would speak a little bit more to the alternative economic models that you're thinking about with the cooperative.
Yeah. So a big part of our work is that it's relationality over transactionality, and recognizing that a part of our cultural teachings and bundles is that our seeds are our relatives, our land is our relatives, they're not commodities, right? And so we're thinking outside the box in terms of indigenous economic development and cooperative development that begins to uncouple this exploitative and extractive way of sort of selling seeds or doing that. So initially we're doing a lot of grant writing to sort of underwrite the capital campaign, but as we move towards the future, we want to decrease dependency on some of those industrial nonprofit complex grant cycles, and create some, whether it's like right now, there's some food hub development all over northern New York. Another project called Sky Woman's Forever Farm is a berry farm that's being rematriated in ancestral homelands in Schoharie Valley. So there's like this idea of each farm hub producing the foods that grow best in their region, and then doing trade, so restoring those trade routes and restoring those barter routes. So okay, we have the berry farm, we have the meat, the Three Sisters, and reestablishing these trade routes in a good way. So again, we don't have it all figured out, but there's a real commitment to engaging in a food and seed distribution system that pushes back on the commodification and the extractive nature of the capitalist system. And a lot of people will say, well, it can't be done. The capitalist realist myth that I always say, like, people can more readily imagine the end of the world before they can imagine the end of capitalism, right? Like, that's something we struggle with, and so I think we really need to push back on that and look into indigenous communities on the way that food and seed and nourishment has been shared and distributed in ways that are outside of the capitalist sort of blindfold that we have on these days. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Well, to end my questions for you, I just want to ask if there's any call to action or items that you would like folks to think about moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important part, we always get questions of like, how can I help? Like, how can I get involved? And I think the most important call to action is for each and every one of you who are guests and guests here on Turtle Island. What are the ways in which you can connect and establish meaningful relationships with the tribal communities in the region where you live, whether that's through Segorte Land Trust, like paying your land taxes, engaging with reciprocity and giving back to the tribal communities that are still thriving and living here under this colonial project. But the other call to action is more intimate, I think, and that's part of this, like, kind of stitching it back around to the story that I brought in to the beginning, which is that if every single one of you who came here to listen, whether you're in person or online, can think about that question that I asked myself when I was 17 years old, which was, what were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors, right? And that we all have an opportunity to leave this space and to think about one food plant that your ancestors cared for, prayed alongside, lived alongside, prepared in their kitchen, and find some sort of reverent curiosity to re-engage in a meaningful relationship in that way, whether it's making a little altar to that plant in the middle of your table, or planting it in a little garden or in a pot on your balcony, like just re-engaging with an ancestral plant in a meaningful way. Just, there's something small and brave and beautiful in that act, and that it's like the seed. It's like something so, I call it an intimate immensity. Like, it's something so small but so big in that act. And if I hadn't have done that, I wouldn't be where I am. And the just immense amount of healing and care and just lived experience that I've gained through being willing to accept the invitation of those plants to grow alongside them. And so that's kind of the call to the like intimate call to action to you all, is to leave this space with that question in mind of what were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors, and take one tiny step in the direction of rematriating yourself and reconnecting yourself to those plants and seeds in a good way. Because I think when we do that, I think sometimes we often don't think, I think we undermine the power that happens in those tiny intimate acts. Like our activism can be big and loud, but there's something so powerful about the little intimate, small little ways in which we make change in the world, whether it's just in our small little groups with our families or with our communities, that I think is really powerful and profound in times like these.
Well, thank you so much. Rowen, we're going to turn it over to the audience now for questions. So if you're in the room, there's QR codes on your chair. And here we go. Okay, well, the first question is, how does the climate crisis affect and possibly change your work with seed keeping?
Yeah, that's a great question. So climate instability and chaos is here. What I always like to remind folks is that plants are so incredibly resilient and adaptive, way more so than we humans ever are. And so, again, I think the climate crisis just lights a fire under my work and lights a fire under many of us Indigenous land stewards and seed keepers, to say that now more than ever, our wisdom, our knowledges, our lived experience, our cultural understandings are needed more than ever to curb the destruction and devastation that comes with the climate crisis. And so again, whether it's putting friendly fire back to the land, or whether it's keeping these land races, these diverse land races that are bioregionally adapted, so that they can continue to evolve in the face of all of these changes, and can continue to be those foods that we rely on, that require less inputs, that require less water, that are more drought tolerant, that are more resourceful in the way that they utilize the nutrients and everything in our gardens. I think those are like these little arcs or islands of diversity that we can keep alive. And so I think, again, going back to what I was sharing about the biodiversity hotspots that Indigenous peoples caretake, those are islands of climate resilience, right? That those are places where, seeds that can endure long droughts, or seeds that can endure the floods, or those plants have such a better way of adapting to the ups and downs and fluxes of the world more than us humans can. And so just keeping those alive, that diversity is what's going to keep us continue to evolve in a good way, and move us in the direction of I guess curbing the consumption and curbing all of the various things that are driving the climate crisis as we know it. So yeah, I don't think it's too late.
This viewer writes, "Thank you for the amazing work that you're doing and for reminding me of the years when my grandmother would save seeds from the garden. I'm curious if the work that you're doing would apply to Indigenous tribes in South America who have been living in rainforests. What could be saved as seeds, considering that some Indigenous people from those lands are bringing in seeds from the city? How might a healthy relationship to seed keeping be created in this instance?"
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is replicable everywhere. And it's not just limited to sort of annual or domestic food crops. I think we need to think about this at scale, in terms of the agroecological sort of relationships inside of forests and rainforests and other places. Like, it's not just about saving corn, beans, and squash. It's about like all of the different plants, and how are we keeping that genetic, biocultural diversity alive in all of these spaces. I think that globalization, a lot of my work in earlier years, was really focused on the impacts of globalization and the consolidation of and industrialization of the food systems and the impact on Indigenous communities, whether it's in Hawaii or in South America or North America, that there has been across the globe a dismantling of this relationship between people and seeds, right? And so you're seeing, whether it was like because of the IMF or, all of these different, efforts to commodify and to sever people's connection with seeds. You're seeing this across the globe. We were talking earlier about our time in Mexico and how more and more there was this, because of the Green Revolution, the way that, certain seeds were being pushed, it was like, and, farming's not easy, as a farmer myself, like year in and year out, like it's not. And if in times where things are tough, if there's somebody coming in promising you this like golden, the golden seed that's going to work for anybody, for everybody, like, I don't fault those farmers for drinking that Kool-Aid, for saying maybe this, could be something magical and amazing. And what that ended up doing was them, many people, because of the pressures of globalization and urbanization and industrialization, setting aside their Indigenous landrace seeds and taking on these seeds that were, promised them like high yields or cash crops and all of these things. But what we're seeing from a global perspective, whether it's the work that's being done in India, there's incredible work being done in South America and Ecuador, Bolivia, work up here that's recognizing that, that those green revolution myths, that, the destruction that had over several decades, they're doing the active work to dismantle it and to get people to return back to those Indigenous landrace seeds that, while maybe don't have the immediate yield results that some of these hybrids and GMOs have in the short term, have a much a much longer trajectory of sustainability. So I think all of these, we're doing work up in the, in the global north here in North America. But like, for instance, the work that we were doing with seed rematriation, I just want to give an example of the way that the work that we've been doing with Indigenous Seedkeepers Network has influenced things on an international level, which is that the seed rematriation work that we were doing with Seed Savers Exchange, which is the largest national public access seed bank in North America. It's located in Decorah, Iowa. I served on their, I always say I infiltrated their board, but I served on their board of directors for a little while and initiated a seed rematriation partnership between the Indigenous Seedkeepers Network and their seed bank. And we looked into their seed bank and found all of these varieties that have Indigenous provenance and origin, and ended up contacting tribal communities and rematriating those seeds back into those communities and creating frameworks and all of these different pathways that would happen in a good way. And that work caught the attention of, so there are a number of seed banks across the globe that fall under this global crop trust network. And there was a seed bank in Mexico that largely housed, so there's like basically this network of seed banks that exist in places of origin for economic significant crops like corn and wheat and other things. And so the corn seed bank for that global crop trust is based in Mexico. And so they caught wind of the work that we were doing in collaboration with Seed Savers Exchange and doing that rematriation work. And some of amazing, innovative women inside of that seed bank basically adopted some of the frameworks that we were using and started their own rematriation work in those seed banks in Mexico, rematriating some of that seed in the Mexican seed bank back to the villages to push back again against that, the impact of the Green Revolution and what that had on the local seed resiliency in communities. And again, there is this, I just want to say that there's just to remind you that so many of those seeds that ended up in Svalbard, for instance, like the global seed vault in the Arctic, or these seed crop banks across the globe were taken without consent from communities, right? And so there is an aspect of biocolonialism that happens when seed is aggregated and concentrated and stewarded ex situ, which means like outside of the evolutionary environment that it was grown in. And a lot of those seeds were taken away from traditional communities in a very colonial way without consent. And so part of this rematriation movement is restoring those seeds back to their tribes and communities of origin in a good way. So that's just an example of the way that the small work that we're doing on the ground here is influencing the international seed rematriation and seed sovereignty movement.
What a wonderful story. That's great. To bring it local, Mark Curtis asks, for those of us Bay Area coastal farmers who want to grow more native and naturalized foods and help in saving seeds, how can we offer plots for Native American sanctuary farming? How do we engage the Indigenous communities to support the future of seeds?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities, like whether it's through the land trust like Segorte or connecting with us through Indigenous Seedkeepers Network. We have regional networks across Turtle Island of, clusters of Native folks doing this work. And so again, the invitation is here is that this work is intercultural. We all have resources and skills and land and things that can be contributed. So I would highly recommend you to go to the Indigenous Seedkeepers website. There's like ways you can, sort of put in your resources and share outward about what you might have to offer and be able to be in touch with some of the folks that are doing that here in the Bay. Yeah.
And I've heard you speak before also about how this is slow work and it's relationship building work and just the taking your time to make relationships.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I mean, we always say like, all this stuff moves at the speed of trust, right? And social change moves at the speed of relationships. So part of this is really taking self-accountability and responsibility to keep our like saviorism in check. And saviorism, it's not just white saviorism. Saviorism comes from people of all colors, right? Like we mean well, but like there is a aspect of this where just really taking responsibility for the privileges that you have, the privileges of landowners or land stewards, and really recognizing that there's been many, many generations of betrayal and hurt and violences done unto Native people here in California and beyond. And so while you may come with good intention, it may take time, right, for trust to build. Like, in that rematriation partnership that we did in the Hudson Valley, we look back, hindsight is 20/20, but we look back and we say, you think when you have all these good intentions, you have these people who have resources or land or skill sets or, just their own time and labor, and they're coming together. And then there's a lot of mistrust, right? From Native people towards non-Native people, not because you're not a good person. It's just because there's been this legacy and lineage of harm and violence. And so we were looking at what we want to see in a partnership is the arc of trust sort of starting here and like kind of consistently moving up and up over time, over those 12 years that we worked together. But really what that arc of trust looks like is like, we're having an amazing harvest and everybody's so happy and excited. And then like rock bottom, we're having like, really difficult generative conflict situations where, hurt feelings or saviorism rears its ugly head, or, people, having, just a lack of understanding of their own privileges and how they show up in spaces. But then we'd have like a good moment where we'd have a work day and things would be, would be good again. And then we'd have a hard, conversation. Over time, the arc of trust is moving up, right? It's moving up and we're strengthening that trust. But what we have to recognize is that to undo the damages and harms of the colonial project, There is going to be conflict transformation that needs to happen. There is going to need to be humility and a particular way of showing up in the work, a thick skin, right? An ability to recognize that, this work is hard. And when work gets hard like that, it means we're actually doing the work, right? It means we're doing the work of reparations. We're doing the work of reconciliation and rematriation. And so in my work, I've had to do a lot of professional development myself. I do a lot of mediation and conflict transformation and facilitation in these groups to really help, sort of, I guess, mitigate some of the intensity, because, and again, sometimes it's like, you have your own cultural lenses, your own cultural biases. Like when we would do some of the seed rematriation work and we go into Seed Savers Exchange, and there'd be these lab techs who are in this basement, like working with seeds all day, every day, like doing germination tests and sort of doing like profiles of how these seeds grow. And they have their whole language of how they talk about seeds. And it's through a very Western botanical scientific lens of speaking about seeds. And they're calling them germplasm or accessions or specimens. They have all this different language. And we would bring Native elders or community members into those spaces, and they would be very hurt by the way that those scientists were speaking about their relatives, their community members in that space. And so there was a lot of work to create cultural competency and to create to elevate and bring literacy into the space so that people weren't unknowingly harming, like they weren't malintended by using that language. That's just their cultural lens that they're seeing the work through. And so there was this cultural literacy building that had to happen. But what we have to recognize is that it can't all be the burden of the Native people always educating the non-Native people in the space. Like, how are our non-Native allies and accomplices in this work meeting us halfway or more in doing the work yourself to really decolonize your relationship with seeds, with language, with science, with all of these things. That's a requirement when we partner in this work, is to try and see the ways that your cultural bias shows up.
Yeah, doing that personal work and sticking with it, like you say, and the learning that happens with staying with the difficulty in those moments.
Absolutely.
And speaking of potentially difficult moments, there's a question about motherhood here. As a mother and educator, do you have words of wisdom for raising teens in urban spaces that are entranced by all the things that go so far away from seeds?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old. And it's funny because we did have moments, like they were raised on a seed farm. I always laugh and say, we have pictures of them younger, and we say it's not child labor, it's passing on tradition. That's kind of our little mantra, and the kids would roll their eyes and they too, even my own children who were raised in this good way, they had their moments of we want to be town kids. We want to why are we living? My son is skater and was concrete deprived, and always wanted to be in town. but over time, I always say this. It's you can write things on their heart, by the way that you act and immerse them in all of this. And part of this is, that Khalil Gibran poem that speaks about our children are not our children. They're destined to do all of these other things. We can't make them do the things that we want them to do. That's an immediate recipe for teenagers just running to the hills, And so for us, it was always creating an environment where they were welcome to participate. They could, there was no forcing of the hands of, you got to do this farm work and do this, and this is your legacy and your burden. This was my bundle. This is my bundle and my life's work. And I will raise you in it, and I will make sure that you know the flavors of our ancestral foods and the stories and the songs and the prayers. And that will be written on your heart. Surround them with it. But don't force it on them, allow them to be in it. And I watched both my kids have their moments of being in it and pushing back on it and saying, I want something different. And then within a couple of years, like them coming home and, you know, we're in this phase of open nest parenting where they're kind of flying in and out of the coop a little bit, flying in and out of the nest, and they'll come home and like scarfing down like corn and beans, like my pozole or my, you know, squash, and just like how comforting and how important that is to who they are. And so that's, I think my advice is like, whatever ways that you can immerse our young people like in this work without sort of, again, being paternalistic or sort of shoving it down their throats, just creating fun environments. And, you know, again, we do that in our seed hubs, is just, you know, create these environments where food is present, everybody loves a good meal, you know, how can we get them around that space? Yeah, there's a lot of things that are written on their heart that will rehydrate those good things in a good way, but we have to be patient with them, you know. And the other thing I'll say is that a lot of the times in movement spaces, we're always like heavy on the like centering youth and like being all about young people and like, oh, the youth is they're going to be our saviors, they're our future, you know. And actually that can be like, I've spent a lot of time in the last like 5 to 8 years around teenagers. It's not fair to them to like put all of the onus and responsibility of cleaning up our mess onto them, and that has a huge impact on our young people, their disillusionment, the burden of what it means to be the inheritors of this messy late stage capitalism that we're in right now. And so I think in some ways it's important to remember that like we're doing this work together, we're working alongside them, that it's not just the youth who will have all the answers and all the solutions for us to change this, but that we're sharing that burden and sharing that responsibility with them so that they don't feel so like put upon in that way. And that sort of what I love, I think, when we talk about intergenerational spaces is that, we always talk about what we have to learn from elders. We have so much to learn from elders. They have so much to share with us. But not all old people are elders. Like, we have, I think, a cultural phenomena now where not all old people get cooked into being elders, that there's like some work that we have to do in order to become elders. And young people are also being born with an incredible amount of wisdom and knowledge and understanding. And so sometimes we can have in movement spaces, sometimes this what I call adult supremacy, which is like the adults know what's best and that the elders, always know. But how are we creating spaces where young people are also being asked, like, what are the gifts and the evolutions and the adaptations that they're bringing to the table to help us to reseed our imaginations of what food and seed and community and culture can look like, because some of the stuff that they're coming through with is just beautiful and amazing. And so just trying to find that balance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There's so much more that we could do to create room to respect the creativity and the ingenuity of youth without putting those pressures on them to fix our problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, with that, we're going to close. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining in the room and online.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Wow. Thank you all. Now we'll go on. All right.